Oh god, boy, well, we got a lot to talk about today. Let's just jump straight on into it. Today, guys, is a much anticipated video from an awful lot of you. The end of a very long project that's been in the wings for a while now. Today, I want to talk a little bit about, well, what you see in the title, I suppose. Right, Guild Wars 2 as a game has a pretty interesting problem. As an MMO, it attracts and it caters to a very wide user base, all with many different expectations and tolerances of different kinds of content. Their views on what's repetitive, what is mandatory content, and what is not. Their perspective on grind, and so on. It's a huge game, and with a wide variety of different speeds and different ways to play it. It's also a game that's been out for a few years, and it's been constantly shifting under the feet of those who play it regularly. At release, for example, the tuning of experience gain was very different. There were no tomes of knowledge for instant level ups, or many of the other sources that are in the game today. At release, also, there was only exotic gear, a totally different trait system. There were less runes and sigils and stat types. A year after release, things were very different to that, with various types of ascended items coming into the game through very specific acquisition processes that were quite gated. A year later than that, things were different again, with login rewards and laurel rebalances. A year later, there was Heart of Thorns, and there were more shake-ups, and even more with Living World Season 3 today, and new ways of getting gear in the new maps, the PvP stuff, the collections. And with every change, there have been enormous differences in inflation and the in-game economy, from leather being worth nothing to lots, mystic coins, changes in silk and powerful blood, and things like fine materials and jewelry, foods, orichalcum, and on and on and on. Basically, as time has passed, how the established user base perceives the game's accessibility, with their understanding of mechanics and their multiple alternate characters and their potentially years of login rewards and countless other things, that perspective from the established user base has fallen out of line with what the game really is, with the new user's perspective. For about a year now, we've seen the addition of raiding in Guild Wars 2. Real endgame, real challenging group content, as ArenaNet initially put it. Now, if you're just here on this video to bitch about raiding, about your preconceived notions on what it is in Guild Wars 2 based on nothing more than the name and your associations with it from other MMOs, that it should never have been in the game and what you think about all that entails, I really don't care, and that's not what the point of this video is about. The point is that since this edition, Guild Wars 2 has shifted to a place where we distinctively have an area that new players will join the game and they will aim for. In many MMOs, this is a big part of the game too, and accessing decent raiding means boring gear grind and dailies for months. And so the question becomes, how accessible is it in this game? How much of a grind, how many hours of playtime, how much effort is involved in going from the early game stuff where there are very few players to late game where all your friends and everyone else is? How long does it take to go from 0 to hero? It's not an easy question to answer, because Guild Wars 2, as I've explained, has a problem. Now, looking for online for help might lead you very much astray. You'll encounter a tremendous mix of different opinions. Messages from established players who think things are much easier than they are, new players who could be subjecting themselves to experiences they really don't have to, or most likely, contemporary advice from players that once quit, but in the truth have opinions outdated by 2 or even 3 years that they still stubbornly stand by. The truth is this, it's very hard to find a real answer to this question. Seeing this, and knowing my own opinions as an established player could be drifting away from reality, I set out to try and answer it. And that's what Zero to Hero was. After a great many streams, we're done. So today, I want to talk to you guys about what I found out, give you some conclusions, talk a little bit about what we did, and maybe open our eyes and hopefully update the community's impressions in general as to what the state of the game is for new people. Obviously, Guild Wars 2 needs to be able to cater to new people. They are the lifeblood of the game. The developers can not only cater to the ever-shrinking established player base and never care about anyone new, I actually think this stuff is incredibly important. So, let's talk about exactly what I did. This was the premise of the whole series and what I'm summing up for you guys now, right? I took a new account, all right? An account from Guild Wars 2. It was technically not a totally new account, but for all intents and purposes, it was a new account that had no money on it. It had no currencies on it. I had no alternate characters that I could swap to on it. It was like as pure of a new player state as I could reasonably get to. Right? And that's a very important and difficult thing to do, because you have to understand Guild Wars 2 is a game nowadays filled with account binding. After you've made just one character, you've got all your gold on the next character character that you make, and you've got tons of different currencies like karma, and you've got access to even the best gear in the game is all account bound that you could just swap from character to character to character. So going back to a new account state to get right back to the beginning is very important. For this, I played on an entirely different account to the one I regularly play on as an established player. So over the course of several 2 hours streams on Twitch over the weekends, I just played this new account, a new character on the new account, and the idea was to see how long it would take me from the very start to get to a point where I could comfortably raid. And we determined this as being a point where people would happily take me in their LFG pugs, right? I could join an LFG and actually clear some content. So this was the goal, and at the very end of the series, we even did a ceremonial stream where I did indeed take this totally new character on a new account, go into raids with totally random people, and actually start killing bosses on it and getting all of the crazy rewards at the end of the game. So this was the goal. It was to see how long it takes to get appropriate armor and runes and weapons and sigils and trinkets, and how long it takes to unlock your character's elite specialization and all that progression stuff that is a part of Guild Wars 2. And I made a note of the various time thresholds as we crossed them to see how much playtime it all took. I ended with what I consider a very real-world demonstration of what it's like to take a character into raiding from the beginning and to score kills. At every step, I tried to be as scientific as possible about this, but of course a lot of what this is based on and a lot of the criteria we established is going to be based on conjecture, and there's going to be some personal feeling here. What I did here, and I hope to talk about that today, wasn't flawless. And it would be very hard to do this flawlessly because the game is so big and complicated. Various aspects of this are very much going to be open to debate, and I kind of want to have that with you guys now. Starting at the top of the list, let's get one thing out of the way. I know a lot of you guys are thinking about it, and trust me, it's a question I have been asked a million times throughout this series. Bluntly, you might be thinking, okay, but Wooden Potatoes, you're an established player who's played the game since it launched. You know a lot of stuff about the game. What exactly does it prove if you play a new character and you get to the end game? And so what about what you experience? You're not actually a new player. Well, to be honest, I think you have a valid point there. You're absolutely right. This experiment, what I'm talking about in this video, this is not going to give you the true time it takes for a genuinely real new player to get from 0 to hero. I can't give you that experience because I'm not new to the game, and I'm not going to sit there and pretend that I'm new to the game and sort of fake do things badly. So if you're going to view this video as only having value under that light, then yeah, it would be flawed, and you're totally right. And to that extent, I would also point out, if you are looking for a real total noob experience, then there are hundreds of people on Twitch every day at the bottom of the Guild Wars 2 section who are exactly that. These people deserve viewership, and you can just click any of them to see how they're getting along and how fast they go. I know, I understand this point, and that's really not what I'm doing this experiment for. The point of this experiment is not to replicate being a total noob, but it's to show people what any new player who takes the time to inform themselves about various areas of the game to a reasonable degree can genuinely accomplish. I'm not saying that new players will experience what I'm about to talk about in this video. I'm saying that new players can experience this if they take the time to learn a bit about the game. And ultimately, if you're getting into raiding, you're gonna have to take the time to learn at some point how to play your class, how to do the encounters, whatever. So that's the idea of this series. And now when I say to a reasonable degree, I get it, that's fairly nebulous wording there, I appreciate that, but I hope you also understand the gist of what I'm saying. I don't want this run to be all about insane, unreasonable, hyper-intense, speed-clear craziness that no sane player would want to try, and only the biggest, best experts could execute anyway. No, 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 no. There are lots of different routes, and there's way more try-hard ways of going through the game that I could have done in this series, but I didn't. Maybe because I didn't know about them, or because I thought they were too intense. I want this to be about what a new player can reasonably do with just a little bit of thinking about how to play the game and a bit of foresight and a bit of understanding. Reasonable to me meant 2 hours a day of what on the weekends of what I consider casual play, and I really can't express it any better than that to you. However, you should understand every second of this entire run is online on YouTube on a playlist, which you can check out in the description. So if you want to feel for how intense this gameplay was, and I'd describe it as casual, you can check it out there. And there is another thing about me. It's not just that I'm an established Guild Wars 2 player and I know what I'm talking about with the game, but maybe there's another problem with this series, and that's the fact that I'm Wooden Potatoes. So as big-headed as that sounds, there is kind of an element here where in MMOs, streamers and YouTubers, we can potentially get sent stuff by fans, or we can get into squads and parties, and we can get shortcuts, have a great many opportunities that a regular normal person wouldn't have. And I identified that, and this I tried to filter out as best I could. The fact I'm wood and potatoes at every step of the way here, I tried to eliminate as best possible, and we'll get into specifics on that in a second, because there's only one area that it really mattered, and that was right at the end when I was trying to LFG like a new player would, but we had a fear that I was getting free rides because people just wanted to be in a party with me. We'll get to that soon. So, speaking of the run itself, let's get into it. You guys know what I did. I started from a fresh account state. Well, here's another little thing that we can discuss too, that I think is quite interesting. It's what I chose as a starting point for the run. See, practically speaking, and I believe this is in the favor of my study here, if you will, practically speaking, I started on this little challenge from a point further down than any legitimate player in the real world would. And what do I mean by that? Well, I would hazard that if you're a new player and you've picked up Guild Wars 2, you're probably not going to immediately tunnel vision raids. Most people will make a character, will explore some of the classes, will explore the world at their leisure, will do a bit of the story, will have some fun just by virtue of the fact they're in a new world and maybe playing with the friends that invited them to it in the first place. In that sense, it will be a while for those people before they then decide, hey, I want to get into raiding. And when they do reach that point, because of all their previous playtime and how much account binding happens in Guild Wars 2, they actually have a much bigger leg up, realistically speaking, than me. I would hazard that the number of people who pick up Guild Wars 2 and are instantly tunnel visioning towards raids is very, very minuscule. You know, I started with no gold, with no currencies, with no account-bound gear, with no masteries, with no achievement points, which in theory made it harder for me to get into groups. I had no tomes of knowledge. I had no experience accumulated from dailies building up. I had no materials in my bag. I had nothing. And most other people who start raiding in Guild Wars 2 will have all of those things, and it will give them a boost over my findings. So my findings, you know, they're given a better leeway from that. And a very extreme example of this, by the way, is the level 80 boost. Say, in order to raid in this game, you need to own the expansion Heart of Thorns. Owning the expansion Heart of Thorns gives you a level 80 booster, which lets you skip all of the leveling process. And anyone, in theory, who starts playing the game could use that to quickly level an ult to get them into raids. And I didn't use that level 80 boost, even though I could have, alright? I don't necessarily recommend that noobs do that for their first character, but on their second toon, yeah, sure, why not? Alright, so with that done, there's another pretty interesting thing to talk about. Let's talk about my process for leveling up. So, of course, the first step on this process is we get a new character. Mine was an engineer. That's what Twitch voted on. Different classes will do different speeds. I think engineer's a good middle of the road for what it's worth now that the whole thing's done, so that's nice. And our first goal was to hit level 80 level cap, and that's a pretty recognizable accomplishment in any MMOs. In Guild Wars 2, I've always understood it to be quite a quick process, but funnily enough, my findings on this series, it actually took me a lot longer than I was expecting. To hit level 80, which is just the first step, it took me around 12 to 15 hours. Now, I'm not saying that that is the fastest you can level in Guild Wars 2 when you're on a total zero account state. I'm sure you can do it faster. And anyone with tomes of knowledge and things in their banks already will do this way quicker. But 12 to 15 was pretty interesting to me. So my method here wasn't a slow one. My method was to run around tagging enemies that I thought hadn't been killed for a while to get bonus experience from them. So in this game, if you kill a random mob in the wild like a wolf and he hasn't been killed for several real world hours, you get an extra bonus experience bump on top of that. I picked up some boosters. Again, I started from an absolute zero state, so these are all boosters any new player could get access to through their laurels that they get as they log in. And I would use these boosters as best I can. I'd use food, I'd use fireworks and stuff, and I'd just run around tagging stuff. This is one of the fastest ways to level in the entire game, and it took me about 12 to 15 hours. This is also a very easy method of leveling up, so I could expect any new player would be able to very comfortably do this. That said, To critique it a little bit, I would say it's a bit of a weird way to experience the game for like a complete new person, and not what I'd recommend you do. People probably want to do hearts, and they probably want to do map completion, and they probably want to do story and stuff. So I would expect them to do that and maybe level even slower than I did. But for your second character, I think this is fine. And yeah, that was the time. It took 12 to 15 hours. I wasn't perfectly efficient. You can speed it up by a long way. And personally, I didn't feel like it was a grind. If there's this question of grind so far, you know, I was constantly going to new maps. I was constantly fighting new stuff. I was constantly getting new experiences. It didn't feel like a grind to me to do leveling in this manner. But, you know, that's going to be a personal interpretation for people. Moving on, I'd also just point out that this technique becomes a lot stronger the more players you have with you. And because I was streaming, this was actually something I was very aware of being at risk of like getting an unrealistic result from. Because I'm streaming, people want to play with me, and I could quite easily at any moment get a Zerg running around with me. And, you know, that's not going to be a regular player experience. So as I was streaming, I tried to keep that in mind. I did my best to keep it at 1 to 3 companions as I was exploring. Sometimes it did go over that, which is to the detriment of the run. But in general, I don't think it's impossible for a new player to have a couple of people running around with them. I mean, if you're playing Guild Wars 2, you might have started playing it because of word of mouth, and indeed, I think the majority of people come into the game, it's because of word of mouth, so, yeah. If you are choosing, as a totally new player, to level 100% solo, and you're refusing to interact with anyone, in an MMO, that's a pretty weird idea to me, but if you do insist on doing that, you would probably level slower than this character did, and I'd bump that up to maybe 20 hours or even more. Alright, so, what's really interesting to me now, though, once we had hit level 80, is that leveling took nearly half of the entire time to do the challenge. See, I was expecting leveling to be a very short period of time at the start, and then most of it would be like end game grind, trying to get all the top tier gear to get in. But actually, it was almost half and half. There was more of the stuff after max level, but that was a real shock to me. Before doing Zero to Hero, this challenge, I thought that leveling up was stupidly short and easy in Guild Wars 2, and this has changed my impression of it. I think as an established player, because I've had access to so many free level ups, to put myself back in a world where I don't have those, and to put myself back in a world where I don't have lots of little free XP bonuses from all my login rewards over the years, to go back to a zero state, it has opened my eyes. It is actually a bit longer than I thought, and that to me is a healthy sign for the game. I never really liked the idea that you would just blitz through the entire leveling process, you know, in 5 hours or something, which was kind of my impression before doing this. One other thing to point out, an assessment to make, is I actually messed up on my leveling as well. Guild Wars 2 is now, thanks to a recent patch, which I'll get into in a second, Guild Wars 2 is in a place where you want to have a max level craft of some kind. And so if you are crafting, you can get 7 free levels from crafting, and that can speed you up quite a lot. These were 7 levels I didn't get, so I wasted a bunch of time on this series that new players who inform themselves about the game before they go in to do it wouldn't waste. So you could actually chop a bit of time off from that end, actually, because I basically leveled to 80 and then I did my crafting, when if I'd leveled instead to level 70 and then did my crafting, I would have gained a bunch of free levels that help bridge the gap, right? And I'll point out as well that leveling would be a lot faster on other classes. So we were kind of a middle of the road character. If you instead chose something like a thief, you would go way quicker. Warriors also would be very quick. There are quite a few quick ones. And even on my class, my numbers are probably a little bit slow already for the leveling, because I wasn't very good at actually maintaining my own class's mobility skills. So I didn't maintain swiftness on myself for nearly as much as I could have through a very easy trait on the engineer that I knew existed, I just wasn't using, and I was getting distracted by Twitch chat and stuff. So I think that there are lots of opportunities here to get a faster level up than I did. So though, at level 80, moving on, it was time to look at armor and weapons. There's a big discussion here, something that I feel very strongly about, and I really don't think that there should be any discussion on it. We had to decide what the end point was. So we are trying to get to level 80. We're trying to get raid ready. Well, what do we do? Well, we decided at this point that it would be all top tier, the best gear you can get for all of your trinkets and your weapon. But when it came to armor, instead of going for the top tier, which is ascended, we were instead going to go for one slightly lower. That's exotic. So it was going to be the correct stats, so we were going to use the right thing for our build, and we were going to use the right runes and stuff, but instead of ascended armor, we were going to use exotic armor. Now, so this might strike up a red flag to you, because you'll realize, well, we weren't at stat cap, and surely we should be if we're going to raid. Well, I must stress the understanding that Guild Wars 2 is not like other MMOs, and in truth, you can clear raids in all blues. I think we've seen a couple of different runs of people doing it in all green gear. Most of raiding in Guild Wars 2 is about your skill at the game, your understanding of the mechanics and the classes you bring in there, rather than the actual gear. Now, for new players, you're going to want as good gear as you possibly can get while you're practicing, and to make sure you don't get kicked out of groups and stuff. So I decided the endpoint wouldn't be like blues or greens or any of these things, but we would actually give ourselves very, very, very good gear. But the armor specifically, armor is incredibly expensive still to this day to get at an ascended quality in most methods of acquisition. So difficult that I just don't think it's reasonable to expect new players to have to get it for their first experiences in endgame. Ascended armor is more something extra you can go for later. And not only this, but the difference statistically between exotic armor and ascended armor is incredibly marginal. It is so marginal, I am insanely doubtful that there have been many wipes ever in Guild Wars 2 that have come down to a single player being in exotic armor instead of ascended armor. It's actually kind of a sign of a total noob and fool in the game to require ascended armor to raid. It shows people don't understand the maths, and it shows people are just tunnel visioning to the top, probably because of their conceptions from other MMOs, or they're doing it because they're viewing ascended armor as a proof that you've played a lot or something. In summation, and this is something I very strongly stand by, ascended armor is not important for raids. Exotic is by several degrees of magnitude easier to get, and it is almost exactly as good, practically speaking. And so that's what we went for. You'll have to look to someone else for an experiment that goes all the way up to ascended armor as well. That is something that you would need if you were trying to do a different area of endgame, which is fractals and not raids, but maybe that's a discussion for elsewhere. So these were the decisions that we made. And another thing that I'd like to stress to new players too, about why it's such a good idea to go for exotic armor and then raid instead of waiting hours and hours and hours for ascended, is that once you actually start raiding, there's a very easy collection you can complete while you raid that has the game just throw at you a full set of ascended armor for free, that has like no effort at all to go for. So if ascended armor is incredibly important to you, it's probably still faster to just get the exotic stuff and then earn a full free set in your raids. And you can even use that set to go for, you know, you can have a berserker set on your exotic, and then you can use that new set for a condition damage set or a healing set or whatever. I do not think ascended armor is important, and that was not a part of this challenge. If you're looking for someone to go from 0 to stat cap, unnecessarily so, maybe that'll be something we do in the future, but it's not relevant for raiding, and it never has been. Moving on. Let's start talking about trinkets. So this was one of the most interesting things about Zero to Hero. For those of you that don't know, this is actually my second attempt at the challenge. Last year, I did an attempt of this challenge on a different character before Living World Season 3 had started. And it was much harder back then. Like I said at the start of this video, the game is constantly shifting. We need to continually update our opinions about it. And so one of the reasons I was very excited about reigniting Zero to Hero on a new character, an engineer, was because of the release of Living World Season 3, and specifically, my challenge here, and you should understand this, revolves around a single Living World Season 3 release called A Crack in the Ice. So A Crack in the Ice is a release that you have to now, if you are a totally new player and get into Guild Wars 2, you have to pay gems for. Okay, so in addition, existing players got this for free, but if you were to start this now and you wanted to copy me wholesale, you would need to actually spend a little bit of extra time getting gold to become gems to buy the update, or you could just whack out your credit card if you wanted. It's totally possible, by the way, to do something that I did here, but in the other releases, like the current one, the Head of the Snake and Lake Doric, you can do the same thing. It's just going to be perhaps slightly slower, and it's going to be a bit different. The reason that this run revolves around Crack in the Ice is that that's the release that was currently live when I picked it up again, and also because of berry farming. So berry farming is a thing that you can do in the Crack in the Ice release, which I thoroughly do recommend to people. It's well worth picking up. where you can get very easy ascended trinkets. Other releases, you can do the same thing. It's just potentially slower. You run around, you grab berries after level 80, you trade them in for trinkets that used to be much harder to get. And so this is one of the biggest things about Guild Wars 2 of today versus when Ascended stuff originally came out. I pointed out that you see a lot of people with outdated opinions that they cling to. I believe that you see this most when people were discussing Ascended trinkets. When Ascended trinkets first came out, they were very strictly time-gated in various areas, and the weapons were quite expensive, and the armor was exceptionally expensive. Well, for the trinkets, that's not true anymore. You can, if you have multiple characters, which this account didn't, because I started from a pure zero state, most people won't be at that state. If you have multiple characters, you can deck yourself out via a berry farm with all your trinkets in just a matter of hours, if not a couple of days tops. It's barely anything. It is so fast. And so what I got in this run was from Bitterfrost Frontier, and using the Crack in the Ice released, I claimed a single ring, a single accessory, and a back piece. All right, so of these three things, only one of them was actually important. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to have to get a Crack in the Ice, I don't want to have to pay for that, you probably don't have to. See, the ring that I got was probably completely unnecessary. You don't have to berry farm for a ring. What you're going to find is you're doing Fractals of the Mists for money anyway. And as you're doing Fractals of the Mist for money and other discounts, which I'll get to in a second, you're earning currency that lets you just get 2 rings very easily. You do not need to berry farm for a ring. I actually went slower on my challenge here than I could have. If I just got both rings from Fractals of the Mist, it would have been much better. And that's one less reason to even care about a Crack in the Ice. The another item that I got from a Crack in the Ice was an accessory. Now, I do think using berries to get this accessory was really nice. Your other option for that, realistically speaking, for most new players, are guild missions. Now, if you are a new player and you get into a guild very quickly, and you do missions with that guild each week, you will get both of your accessories faster than I did, because you can do it while leveling, and I waited till the end of leveling to start berry farming to get an accessory. So I actually think you can get both rings from Fractals, and you can get both accessories from guild missions. When Heart of Thorns released, you can get a lot more of the guild mission currency, guild commendations, a lot faster now, and very easily too. And if you guys do take the time to watch my full series on how I accomplished all this, you'll get a real perspective for that. Probably you don't need to berry farm for either of those items. The only thing that really the berry sped up massively was the back piece. The back piece is the important one, and guess what? Every single Living World Season 3 release, as far as I recall, so far, has offered a back piece just like this. So you can probably bypass a Crack in the Ice if you want to. It's just my challenge didn't. Now, as the economy shifts, your ability to get a back piece is going to change a bit if you're not using Living World Season 3 maps. Some people have suggested like Mordry, but for me, the back piece in a Crack in the Ice was by far the best. Our original attempt at this run on a Druid stalled like 70 hours into the run almost, trying to get a back piece, and still with basically no progress on it and very little progress anywhere else. This was huge. It rewound like tons of playtime into a very little bit just for that back piece. And Guild Wars 2 became a lot more accessible very quickly there. The trinkets were not tough whatsoever. So, let's move on. Another little thing that you're going to have to do in your challenge from going from 0 to hero is you're going to need to elite specialize, probably. In fact, of the 9 classes that exist in this game, the meta builds for 8 of them require you to elite specialize. It makes sense. ArenaNet power creep to these things to make it worth buying the expansion. This is another little bit of your progression. You're going to hit level 80, and then you're going to want to elite specialize. This is another area where there's a lot of outdated and nonsense information around on the internet. So I was on an absolute 0 account. I had no masteries, okay? So I couldn't glide. Well, I could glide at the start, but I couldn't, like, glide fast. I would fall out of the sky. I couldn't use mushroom. Couldn't do anything, right? I didn't have my masteries. And the vast majority of them, I couldn't ley line glide, none of the important stuff. And so traversing the jungle was at one of its most difficult levels for me. I didn't have any waypoints or any characters going on that was already in there. What I did was I joined a hero point train. Now, this was a hero point train that I didn't run. I wasn't the commander for it. I didn't really remember or know how to do a hero point train myself, as it's never something I really engaged in very much. But this is a group that you can find of people who run through the jungle, just grabbing all of the hero challenges, which allows you to elite specialize. I really put very little effort into it. I was very slow. I did get the benefit of the doubt that I was winning potatoes on this, I would say, because people knew I was with them and they waited for me when I was a little bit slow keeping up with the group, either because I didn't have the correct mobility stuff on my class, which any new player could correct, or because of the masteries. But all told, I think I did something any standard player could do, and it took us about 70 minutes to elite specialize, or at worst 90. Like, we're talking just over an hour. Community impressions of this are sincerely overblown. There was like a ridiculous backlash when Heart of Thorns released about this, which led to ArenaNet rebalancing and retuning the accessibility of a lot of this stuff far too easily, in my opinion, even with the understanding of how this a new account experienced it. And basically, this is a very, very short part of your game time. You're just going to elite specialize in very short order and move on with your life. If you don't do it in a hero point train, I have no doubt it would take longer, but I wouldn't anticipate more than 4. And yes, I do 100% believe that the community impressions about this are sincerely overblown. That's all that the elite specialization was. It was a portion of one evening. That was it. Moving on. Speaking about elite specializations, there's another opportunity for people who do elite specialize, and that's to get a free ascended weapon from the expansion. So ascended weapons are pretty challenging to get, honestly. They can be very expensive. They require you to craft at least one profession, one discipline that can make it, and then maybe go to some different vendors or craft it for yourself. It can be very expensive. The idea of getting a free ascended weapon is not something a new player should ignore. I didn't go for one of these because I felt that since this was only one of a kind and you couldn't repeatedly do it, it wasn't something I wanted to do on the series. I wanted my series to be like as strict as I possibly could. So I didn't take this opportunity when new players can take this one. Also, there was the fact that as an engineer, there was no weapon for me anyway. I run rifle on my build, the build that I made. And there was no elite specialization weapon for that. They are possible. I would encourage new players to go for them. My instinct is that they're actually a bit harder to get than established players would have you believe, as I experienced doing something similar a year ago on my druid. But they are a good choice, and compared to the time taken to get the money to craft versus the time taken to do this, it might be quicker for you just to do that. Similarly, we've also seen through current events and some other areas in the game, other new ascended weapons coming into the game through collections and side quests. So the Bulk side quest, for example, is very, very cool. Now, my experience and the way I did this was I crafted my weapon. That meant I barely had to touch the jungle. I barely had to touch the expansion. It was only for that hero point train that I really had to care about it. And as I was attempting to get a bit of money from one of the meta events and some armor, that was it in Verdant Brink. Aside from that, I didn't have to touch the expansion much. However, if you go for an elite specialization weapon, you can have a really easy free one from doing that, which will also lead you through the story steps, and at the end of the story steps, you can also get Bulk, which is a really good ascended weapon, top tier for new players. You can transfer its stats whenever you like, pretty much. You can also transform the weapon itself from one type into a totally different one. Very malleable, very good for new players, and probably getting both of those hand in hand is a really good idea. It's just not something that I did on my series. So, next, there's something very important to talk about, and what I would actually consider one of the best updates that this franchise has seen in a long time, and I only appreciate the power of this update because of my experiences here on Zero to Hero. I'm talking about the token update. So, ArenaNet put an update into the game where now, since the update, you have to craft tokens with a crafting discipline that you have maxed out in order to trade for ascended weapons at other vendors. Now, this is very, very important. See, for a long time during our run, while we were in the middle of doing Zero to Hero, the easiest way by far to do this entire series, and I'm talking just a handful of hours, barely anything, right? The easiest way to get all of our gear would have just to have been doing PvP. See, ArenaNet recently added to the game a PvP vendor that offers Ascended gear ridiculously cheap, really easy, so fast it's mind-blowing to think anyone would ignore it. It is crazy. In a single evening, you can have everything done, right? It's insane how amazing that PvP armor vendor was. And, just Ascended vendor was. But some people, as I discussed this on Twitch, didn't like the idea. Some people didn't like the idea that they'd have to PvP in order to accomplish their PvE aim. Some people just hate the idea of PvP. Some people didn't want to watch PvP on the series, so they said that I shouldn't do it. Some people, and perhaps quite rightly so, didn't like the fact this vendor was only available at certain times of the year when a PvP season is live. And it's a good chunk of the year, but it does mean that sometimes new players are locked out of it. And people said I shouldn't do it for that reason. So in the end, we actually did vote not to do PvP, despite the fact that it was such an insane speed up. That actually ended up paying off for us. See, what happened was ArenaNet realized that the PvP method of getting Ascended gear and some of the other vendors in the game that allowed you to get Ascended gear for various currencies, that these were way, way, way too easy. And people now were never crafting their Ascended gear, and there was no need to craft their Ascended gear. The left hand of Guild Wars 2 did not know what the right hand of Guild Wars 2 was doing. Some systems were undermining the existence of others. And so they did a very intelligent update where they said, right, well, if you want to use that PvP vendor, you need a token. To craft the token, you need to max out your crafting discipline, thus unifying the systems in the game. And this applied to the other vendors too, like at Fractals of the Mist. This is incredibly important and powerful. It signals to all new players that come to Guild Wars 2 that the route is hit level 80, get your elite specialization, do the crafting. Craft to 500, get access to all of these vendors, and then you can get your discounts elsewhere. But crafting to 500 is an imperative part of the process. And because of the decisions we made on Twitch, we kind of lucked into exactly that. So that's what we did. We did the route any new player will have to do. We got to level 80, we crafted to 500, we made our weapon through that. And so that paid off really beautifully. I love that update. I love that the devs unified and laid bare what they expect the players to do with the game. It's very smart. And I like that all the economies and things involved with crafting are now actually important and integrated. So, how do we get that money? And what else is there to talk about in relation with that? Well, Fractals of the Mist. So, once we got to this point, we basically just had to earn cash, right? And in my opinion, the best way to earn cash, if you play kind of casually and, just for a couple of hours to do some dailies and then you can come back later, Fractals is an excellent place to do this. I would recommend that all new players go from T1 to T2 Fractals. That's what I learned here. You can invest a little bit into Agony Resistance to help you survive in there, but don't spend too much money on that because you don't care about Agony Resistance really. It's just to get you more money. If you're doing your T2 dailies each day, which is so easy, guys, and not intimidating, it's an excellent way to get lots of money. The other cool thing about this is you get pages every time you go in there, and those pages allow you to get more Ascended gear like weapons and armor and stuff at discount prices once you've hit your level 500 crafting. And in truth, if I was starting 0 to hero now, today, after the token update is live, I would say definitely do Fractals, and instead of crafting a weapon, simply level your crafting discipline up to 500, but then don't actually make the weapon with it, just buy your weapon or your armor or whatever you want from the vendor in Fractals of the Mist, because you're doing Fractals for money and at the same time getting free rings and getting free pages which can be traded in. So this stuff is really, really, really useful. We didn't get to take advantage of that because I've been deleting my pages, perhaps foolishly, and then the update came in a little bit too late, so we ended up crafting. What can I say about crafting? Crafting was pretty much where I expected, fairly standard. Crafting frustrates me in Guild Wars 2. I don't think it's too fun. I did learn, however, that a lot of resources online are very out of date for crafting. There are much better ways and cheaper and faster ways to level than what you can find at some of the top links on Google, so do be aware. For example, I spent more money than I had to. If I'd known about stuff like ineffable recipes, I would have got stuff even cheaper. And yeah, that was the money-making process. Logging in, doing some fractals. Fractals were very varied. I didn't feel like I was grinding while I was leveling. I didn't feel like I was grinding in the 70 minutes for the specialization. The berry farms were a little bit grindy, and we were doing a few of those. But the rest of the game, fractals are super varied every day and will only get more varied over time. I don't think I did any single farm, except the berry runs, more than like 3 or 4 times. In this entire thing, to go from nothing to being ready to raid, I think I only had to do like 2 verdant brinks and maybe 3 silver wastes, maybe 4 silver wastes. The berry runs and fractals. That was it. That was everything. And so this was what was so crazy to me. A huge chunk of this was actually leveling. The actual time it takes at the end was not that major, as long as you make sure you have some guidance as to where you're going. And perhaps that is the game's failing. So I do have some other considerations, some other little things to talk about, little notes before we wrap up this video. And I talk about the results, what we got finally. So I would point out the sort of against my credit here, or the game's credit in being easy or whatever. I was playing in very short bursts over several days. So what that meant was I got a lot of login rewards compared to my playtime. So this gave me a lot of mystic coins and free level ups. Now, more hardcore players who just marathon their way for 12 hours a day won't get those. And so they might end up being a little bit slower, but they would get it in a shorter space of time. I would also point out those mystic coins, most of what you find online are established players crying about mystic coins. Mystic coins at their current price are amazing for new players. So much of my money and so much of my capability to get into the raiding scene was based on the fact I could sometimes log in and just get a ton of gold thrown at me because of these coins, which I would promptly sell. I never had any need to use those coins myself. They're largely for cosmetic and side purposes, and they felt so good to sell and a very, very strong part of the economy for a new player perspective. Another little thing to point out about my run was that I refused to use the gem store. So I never used my credit card to then get gold. Players who do that would have an enormous speed up. They'd overtake my times way faster. The time I'm going to give you in a second of how long this all took, you can slice that way down if people use the gem store. I didn't. I appreciate a lot of people fundamentally wouldn't want to do that. I would say there's a lot of little areas that I played inefficiently with regard to inventory management for various reasons that there's no point getting into. My bank was a mess and my inventory was always a mess, and I could deposit collectibles, and this actually slowed me down a lot. There was a lot of inventory management for me other players wouldn't have. I think that probably would add up. I'd point out that I wasted a bunch of time completing some story steps to enter Ember Bay from the Rising Flames patch when I wasn't quite sure what I was doing, and then I didn't end up using that patch whatsoever, and we focused our efforts on purely berries instead. So I wasted, an hour or so, I think it was, just getting into Ember Bay. I'd point out that festivals like Winter's Day, Halloween, the Lunar New Year, these are immense sources of income for new players. Amazing sources of income for new players. They're fairly frequent throughout the year. I encourage everyone to do those. However, from my results, I basically ignored them as best as possible on the idea, let's go as strict as possible. Let's imagine someone who's not playing during a PvP season or any events or anything like that. Likewise, by the way, the Super Adventure Box offers a fairly low playtime ascended weapon that doesn't really cost any money when the Super Adventure Box is up, which is due in a month for what it's worth. And I'd also point out another cool thing about the Crack in the Ice release is that it's very good for food too. Food is something that you have to earn some money for to actually be able to use in the raid. I didn't really account that into my time, but if you have the Crack in the Ice release, you can get some very cheap food there, the seaweed salad equivalent, and that's a pretty nice extra reason as well. So what was the results? There you go. That's my scrutiny at my own challenge. All right. How long did it take? There we go. Back to the original question. Well, I finished going from level 1 and nothing to having all my gear, level 80, my elite specialization in my late 30s. My late 30s is where I finished, late 30 hours. And the absolute end of the run, once I had cleared 3 raid bosses through LFG, now that was 42 hours. 42 hours, and at that point, I had already, wasted time standing around getting into groups and wiping on some bosses and actually scoring kills. I'd had some experiences of getting kicked from groups. This wasn't an account that had no legendary insights to ping to anyone, no achievement points of any interest to speak about whatsoever, and was getting into raiding for the first time. on a power engineer, which I would also say is a fairly middle-of-the-road required build as well these days in the meta too. So really, really good choice we picked here. I think we've got a very average representation of the game. Nothing, you know, too extraordinary. I will say with my LFGing, I joined a group and people recognized it was wooden potatoes, so I left it immediately because I didn't want special privileges, and we made it very clear that I didn't want anybody to know who I was when I was in these raids. I refused to use TeamSpeak with people. No one knew who I was, but with one of the groups, we did find out after the fact that unfortunately they were familiar with who I was after I joined their group, and we had wiped once on a boss, which is a bit unfortunate, but I can't really account for much more than I did. If you'd like to see our attempts to get around that, of course, every second of all of this is available online. And there you go, that's Zero to Hero. I'm really happy that I learned about this, so let's talk about it. 30 hours? Well, 40 hours? 40 hours? That's a lot faster than I expected. For all of the complaining I see online about apparent grind in Guild Wars 2, 40 hours? From an absolute nothing and missing out on so many opportunities? That's crazy to me. I would have expected at least 100 hours interior before people can feasibly get here. All of my mess ups considered, like if I try and consolidate everything down, all these little things that I've talked about here, if I think of a very asserted new player, but nonetheless maybe already has a character on their account or something, I reckon you can get here in like 20 to 25 hours. Even faster. The level 80 booster. Oh, not to mention people who might use gems and stuff. You could get this so quickly, guys. The game of today may not be the game that you thought it was. New players, by the way, can also consider, if you want some advice from me of what to do first. A lot of people will wonder, they're intimidated. I actually do think I have some fairly reasonable advice having come out of this experience for you. I think that new players should probably focus on getting a power build first, or something that's related to the core stats of the game, because core stats tend to be a bit easier to get. Again, if you watch the series, you'll see how we came to those conclusions. And also, if you're looking for a class to play, with that in mind, I would absolutely recommend, without a shadow of a doubt, there is no question, the best class to play for a new character, and I believe design-wise, the devs want us to say warrior here. I believe the best class to play is Thief. And I say Thief because it can level insanely fast with its mobility. It can also cheese a lot of the original 2012 content with blinds and stuff. I say Thief because you can run a very powerful Berserker build on it, which has very transferable weapons and trinkets and stuff you can take onto your second character or even your third character. So you can hot swap that stuff. And I would also say, on a Thief, you don't need to, like, build interim armor. You don't need to spend time getting money to get gear to help you farm for other gear. You don't have to do that. You just get the best gear immediately. Also, for a new player, Thief is incredibly competitive damage. Very good damage on an incredibly easy damage rotation, which allows you as a new player to focus on the raiding mechanics comfortably. I think Thief is the ultimate new player experience for anyone who's interested in getting into raids in the end, and that is my #1 recommendation for this period of time until we get another expansion and more elite specs. Right now, I think Thief with current balance and is likely to stick there for a long time. The proliferation of DPS meters coming into the game now, I think, are showing more and more that Thieves are really a lot better than the on-paper DPS was showing them before. There are a couple of other little positives that I have learned from this that I think is pretty interesting. I think it's very cool. ArenaNet expressed an intention to have new players progress from open world to fractals to raiding. And that totally works. That is the best way to get there from my experience because of all the benefits that you get in fractals. And the other thing I would say that kind of disappointed me as I learned from this is I really feel ArenaNet should be doing more to incentivize story or something. Most new players will be focusing on story. And you'll notice from everything I said today here, at no point was I ever truly incentivized to do story content anywhere, except a single story step to get into the Bitterfrost Frontier from the Crack in the Ice release. That was it. And I believe that that's pretty upsetting, considering how much reliance modern Guild Wars 2 updates have on the players being engaged with the narrative. Surely there should be a bit more incentive for people to go through and do that. Well, regardless, before I go on to another classic rant for a Quarteria overhaul, I think I will leave it there. Hopefully this gave you guys some insights. Please feel free to critique the hell out of my methodology here. Please do consider actually watching the series. There's a lot of things we are discussing as they happened in real time there. It's about 15 videos. It was just sitting down 15 times to play the game and to get from 0 to hero. And there you go. I'm very happy to have this finished. It took a while as our first character was a bit of a dud. But yeah, hopefully this will get some good discussion going. Hopefully this will allow people to have learned a few things. Thanks very much for watching, guys. And remember, when you play an MMO, there's a lot of chance that things are changing without us realizing. And I think that became very apparent to me as I played this. And I'm glad I kind of refreshed myself to get that experience. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Love to see you in the comments. We'll see you next time. Paid his debt to the Lucky Horseshoe, he was eventually fingered by one of his victims and tried as a thief. His punishment was exile from the kingdom of Kryta. The local authorities blindfolded him and rode him out 3 full weeks before leaving him to fend for himself. Alone, broke and lost, Saul wandered through a dense forest for several days, surviving on only roots and berries. On the 4th day, delirious with hunger, Saul emerged from the trees to see what he thought was a hallucination. A city of massive towers reaching into the heavens. The architecture was astounding, and the creatures who lived here were unlike any he had ever seen. Walking down into their city, Saul got a closer look at the denizens of this place. They were tall and thin, with strange wing-like appendages that waved about in the slightest breeze. When they walked, their feet seemed